Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, the 12th of October, where I wanted to give some final commentary about our upcoming paper number 1. As you know, I have rolling due dates for paper number 1. What would be ideal is if you could hand in paper number 1 early. And honestly, I would take paper number 1 now, but my thinking is that anywhere between the 19th to the 26th. That said, there is some flexibility, but by the 26th of October, we are about halfway through the semester. This semester for this class is a little bit tricky because we're a late start semester, so that means that what is our middle is not necessarily the middle of the academic semester. But I have rolling due dates for all of my classes. If you don't have your paper in by the 26th of October, now I'm starting to have some anxieties about the fact that we are moving into November and that you still don't have a formal assignment due. So do keep me apprised. As you know, this has been a condensed class, so I've been basically trying to move us quickly, and I'm happy to say what that's resulted in is that I can have us spend most of today's class actually working on that paper, since I'm well aware that you did a lot of the readings in a condensed fashion, at least based on the other classes that started earlier in the semester. And you'll see in the notes below that I'm just reiterating some of the elements associated with writing a paper. And you can find that handout about the critical paper, one that was actually given to me many moons ago when I was a college student. You can find that in the syllabus and other documents folder, where it talks about the 3 stages of writing: the planning stage, the writing stage, the editing stage, and your introductory paragraph, which is where you will have your thesis. I'm aware that you may not know what your thesis is yet. You might need to do some writing. And in fact, what you might do is reread everything that you've written and then summarize it in a sentence or two and then plug that in after the fact into your introduction. I myself have done that with my own writing. And you want to list the author and the text that you happen to be discussing, so it's very clear to the reader what the focus of your paper is going to be. Your body paragraphs is where you give your quotation and your paraphrase. This is your evidence in effect to support your particular position. I kind of liken it to an attorney gathering together pieces of evidence and presenting them. I guess you could think of me as the judge if we were going to continue on with this analogy, and that I need to remain neutral, and that ultimately it's based on the arguments that you've made that will determine whether or not your position is possible. It doesn't even need to be probable. Or even beyond a shadow of a doubt. So luckily we don't have to keep to that level of criteria that we would in a courthouse. And then we have a conclusion, and this is where we give our sense of closure. We don't introduce any new arguments, but we give a sense of ending to the reader. And we have to remember that each paragraph must be at least 3 sentences long, hopefully a lot longer than that. Each paragraph deals with a particular topic, and you get to determine that topic, whether how broad or specific you want it to be, based on how you construct that paragraph. And usually your first sentence in the paragraph, the topic sentence, serves as a kind of summary of the main points of that particular paragraph. So you could read, as the handout suggests to you, the opening sentences of all of the paragraphs and basically get a kind of outline, if you will, of your major points. A sentence basically is just an expression of a complete thought, so you should be able to read each sentence as an independent unit and ask yourself, does this make sense by itself? That's the difference between saying something like, I went home, which does make sense by itself, as opposed to saying something like, because I went home, that the word because suggests additional information that you would usually include in the sentences prior or the sentences following. And again, if you're looking at grammar, you don't look at the sentences that come beforehand or afterwards, just at that one main sentence. And then you ask yourself, does it stand as an independent unit? And when you're using punctuation, it's just a way to clarify meaning And that's usually something that we can hear when we have conversation or dialogue with someone. I oftentimes use the example of ending punctuation for a statement like sit down. If we were to have a period at the ending of that, we would state it sit down. But if we were to have a question mark at the ending of that, we would obviously change our vocal inflections to sit down. And then finally, the very last possibility for ending punctuation, the exclamation point, sit down. And of course, you can hear this in my voice, but you can't hear that in your writing. So I suggest that you read your writing out loud to yourself when you are in the editing stage. Try to listen for mechanical errors. Oftentimes you can hear an error, almost like you can hear the wrong musical note played in a song. Even if you can't even if you can't read music or play music, you can identify the error, and oftentimes you can fix it. And that's the same with writing. Even if you can't necessarily identify the error, a lot of times you can hear it, and a lot of times you can fix it, and that's really all you need. Commas are just pauses, and usually these are places right before we want to emphasize something. Or perhaps it's because this is where we would naturally take a breath when we are speaking. Even if we're speaking quickly, and I know I tend to speak quickly, I do take small breaths, usually in places where commas go. Of course, there are rules on how to use grammar mechanics correctly, and two websites that I highly recommend. First being Purdue OWL. You can see that in the notes below under the section about writing papers. And Purdue OWL goes through the entire writing process from the very beginning, generating ideas, which I hope you're doing right now, to the very ending, which is formatting the paper, that it should be typed in double-spaced 1-inch margins. I've also included some of this in our syllabus as well about formatting. And it should include a separate cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that indicates your name and my name and the due date and the paper title. And that said, everybody has the option for writing this paper. So once I receive it and evaluate it for grammar, mechanics, and also for content, I'll return it back to you with a letter grade. But if you wanted to improve your grade, you could do a revision. Just hand in the revision along with the original graded copy so that I can compare and contrast the two and incorporate my comments and suggestions, obviously. And if you need further direction, just reach out to me. And that would be due by the ending of the semester, but obviously the sooner the better for everyone involved. And another website that I highly recommend is the GCC Library website. Purdue OWL website is through Purdue University, but they've made their website public. So you don't need to be a student from Purdue in order to access it. For the GCC Library website, you do need to be a student, but the GCC Library is well aware that students are going to be writing papers. So I've included the link from the library that specifically addresses writing papers. And we are using the MLA system of parenthetical documentation, which means that we are using parentheses at the ending of a quote. It doesn't matter if our sentence is completed or not, to indicate where that quote is coming from. We do that within the body of the paper. And I've given some examples in the notes below about documentation using the MLA, Modern Language Association system, which we use for the humanities and languages. There are other systems, such as the APA, that's focused on the sciences, American Psychological Association. So you want to make sure you're not using the wrong system for the wrong discipline. We're using MLA. And you can see that what you do is that basically you quote, much like I did in the example below. You use parentheses, and then you put your ending punctuation. So the example I've given is quote, Krebs went to the war from Methodist College, unquote, open parentheses, the number 162 to indicate page number, close parentheses, and punctuation. Notice you don't use the word PG or page or anything like that. You want to try to write the least amount of information as necessary within those parentheses for the reader to understand where your quote came from, just so they could verify it if they wanted to. And if your sentence happened to continue, you can continue it on, which is the next example I've given you below. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. Then I've opened my parentheses, 162, closed my parentheses, and then continued on with my sentence. He cannot pray with his mother. And then, of course, I've got my ending punctuation. You can insert things into a quote if you have let's say, a piece of a quote that is unclear. You wouldn't be inserting something if you were, let's say, commenting on the quote. You could do that beforehand or after the quote. But you can decide to insert something within a quote. Usually it's a pronoun that's unclear as to which character that pronoun is referencing, just based on the quotation that you happen to select. In this instance, you use square brackets. So anything inside a quote with square brackets is your information, not the original quote. So the example I've given you in the insertion is, quote, even his, and then within square brackets, Krebs's lies. And of course, Krebs's is in square brackets to indicate that word was not part of the original quote. And then I continue on. Lies were not sensational. And then, of course, I can end my quote, open up my parentheses, put the page number, and close my sentence with my ending punctuation. You can also omit something during a quote, not to change the quote's meaning. You don't want to do something that's unethical. What you want to do is omit something just because it just isn't relevant. Now, you get to decide where to start and end your quote, so you don't have to worry about the information that came before the quote or the information that came after the quote. But between your starting and ending point, which can happen in mid-sentence if you'd like, between point A, your starting point, and point B, your closing point, if you were to leave out a word or several words, again, just because they're not necessary, not because you want to change the meaning, you would use what's known as an ellipsis, or fondly known as the 3 periods or the 3 dots. And you can see that in the example I've given you below as well. If you ever see that inside of a quote, that means something was omitted. Again, I direct you to Purdue OWL and the GCC library, which talks about quotes. If it turns out you were using a long quote, something that's considered long would usually be over 3 lines of typed text. You indent in that quote so that it looks like a block quote, so that basically it's very clear to be able to identify where the start and end point is for that quote. And because you're indenting in that way, that means you don't need to use quotation marks. I apologize for some of the noise outside that you might be able to hear. They're doing some landscaping when I am recording this, but I am coming to the ending of my recording, so hopefully this isn't too distracting to you. So again, if you've got a long quote, what you do is you block it off, you indent it. This would be a quote that would be over 3 lines of text. And because you're indenting it, you do not need to use quotation marks. It's considered to be redundant. Of course, there has to be a little wrinkle in this. You would have your end punctuation before your parenthetical documentation, as opposed to the other way around, the way we usually use our parenthetical documentation, and then the ending punctuation. Again, I'm hopeful that this is all review for you, but there are 2 great websites, and you can also reach out to me as well. So basically, today I wanted to leave you with working on your paper, and I do not have a formal attendance question for you today, though certainly if you are experiencing any issues with your paper, please reach out to me today, so via email, so that I can give you some direction. But I'm going to leave it in your hands, so to speak, for you to begin working on paper number 1. And hopefully you're not just beginning, hopefully you are continuing the work that you've already done with paper number 1. So that next class, we can begin talking about Oedipus the King, and hopefully you can begin handing in your first paper. I'm thinking anytime between now up until the 26th, though my suspicion is most of you would probably choose somewhere between the 19th to the 26th, would be a wonderful time to hand in that paper. But again, if it turns out that you can't hand in that paper on the 26th, do contact me, let me know what's going on. And as you are also writing your paper, in an ideal world, I am hoping that you are in the midst of reading Oedipus the King, but we will also be watching performance as well. So I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well, and good luck with your paper. I look forward to reading it soon. Take care. Bye-bye.